Click subscribe to get daily Manchester United content from passionate Reds, only on All for United.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, supporters of Manchester United Football Club. Welcome to another episode on All for United, a very special All for United show. We're going to be talking about two very exciting players currently playing in the Bundesliga who have certainly caused a lot of interest involving Manchester United over the recent weeks and months. Dennis Zakaria and Amadou Haidara. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot about both of these players in the company of John Zuidema, an analyst from the States who knows these players inside and out. John, a warm welcome to All for United. How are you doing over in America?
Good, man. I'm happy to be with you today. How are you?
I'm very well. I hope the weather is better there than in the northeast of Scotland, but it is what it is, I guess.
We got a little bit of snow on and off this week, so it's been nice.
Absolutely fantastic. Before we go into the show, John, can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and what you do? Because, as I said in my intro, you're working in the States. I think you're at Temple University. Is that correct? Just give us a little bit more of a background to what you do.
Yep. So I'm a Temple University student. I'm a sophomore, second year for people who don't know what that means. I'm studying management information systems, which is kind of a data science hybrid with business. And I also work with our soccer team as a bit of a data analyst, a tactical analyst, just kind of help the coaches out with whatever they need. It's really a cooperative effort at the college level. So kind of fill whatever roles are needed, whether that's ordering food for the team on away days or looking through GPS data or whatever it is. So it's kind of what my day-to-day is school and the soccer team.
Excellent stuff. It sounds like you've got a very varied role there, which I'm sure will be very good. Just to say, if people are tuning in, please remember to like and subscribe at All for United for all genuine Manchester United content for fans, for people who are tuning in. And remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all other social media platforms. John, before we go on to talk about Zakaria and Haidara, just give me a little bit of a flavour as to how you managed to get involved with the German Bundesliga, because that's a very interesting league to follow.
Yeah, so I'm actually a Dortmund fan. I grew up watching Dortmund through kind of my parents because my family is from the Netherlands. And so we also have kind of spent some time in the German area and just grew up watching Dortmund. And a couple years later, began playing FIFA around 12, 13 years old. Marco Reus becomes one of my favorite players. So I really fell in love with Dortmund. And then after that, subsequently, the entire league. I love the way that the fans act, and kind of it feels a little bit more of a pure idea of what football should look like with the kind of the lack of money infusion. And it's just a great league to watch. High entertainment value, and I highly recommend it.
And of course, right at the height of the pandemic at the very beginning, the Bundesliga was one of the first leagues that came back, didn't it? And I think so many people really took a real interest in picking one team to follow and just kind of latched onto them.
Yeah, it was really a fun phenomenon to see on social media, where people would just kind of pick a team and run with it, and you got kind of fans of random teams kind of all across Europe and across the world now, because it was the only league on.
Yeah, I know, it's great to see, and I think the Bundesliga really is one of the most quality leagues in there in Europe. And even though Bayern Munich are absolutely fantastic, aren't they? There's so many great teams in that league, aren't there?
Yeah, you've got a whole host of teams that over the course of kind of recent history have been really successful. Frankfurt's a really fun team to watch, especially this season. Leipzig's obviously been excellent in recent years. Gladbach is an excellent team. So loads of fun things going on there. It's been fun to watch Freiburg a lot this season. If you're kind of a 4-4-2 fan, I would highly recommend watching Freiburg. They're one of my favorite teams to watch. So yeah, it's a really diverse league with a lot of fun teams to watch and a lot of successful teams in Europe too.
And of course, in keeping with Manchester United, as of course this is All for United, obviously early in the summer, Manchester United signed Jaden Sancho from Borussia Dortmund. What have you made of Sancho's fitting into the Premier League? Because it's been a bit of a learning curve for him a little bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, so you're tapping into my market there a little bit. Sancho's a really interesting player where I always said when the rumors started that he would kind of struggle with United in the Premier League because he struggles with kind of that dynamic dribbling. He's not very fast. He's not hyper athletic. And he tends to dribble a little bit more than really he should for someone with his physical characteristics. But the biggest problem is I feel like United are still struggling with that overarching structure and kind of the team tactics, and you're not catering to Sancho's strengths by playing him kind of in an isolated attack. He was best when he had Hakimi, had Munir, Rafa Guerrero. Like, you've got a host of players who really support him on overlaps and underlaps and work with his physical characteristics, kind of create with space rather than with kind of the ball at his feet, if that makes some sense. So I think it's coming with time, and we've seen the improvements for sure, but the learning curve hasn't really surprised me personally.
What have you made of Manchester United so far this season? We're going to obviously talk about two players who United are really keen to look at and perhaps get, not maybe even this window, but certainly in the summer. What have you made of United this season under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, first of all, but also latterly under Ralf Rangnick?
So I was not the biggest Ole fan, but I think there was a lot of problematic things that we saw at the beginning of this season. And the biggest thing is just it feels like the team is very much kind of playing on their own. And Ronaldo kind of hyper accentuated that because of his, I don't want to say ego, but kind of just his character and who he is as a person demanded a little bit more of a presence. And I think it really dragged the entire team down a little bit more. Moving after Ole, I think Rangnick has been an improvement in some ways. Like, I think we're watching a team actually attempt to execute some more tactical principles. And it's improving, but you had a team who a lot of the players played under Mourinho even. And they haven't really gotten the chance to play under a true modern manager, so to speak. And so you've got a serious learning curve. And even like you look at Ronaldo's career, and he hasn't played under any of these modern managers over the course of his entire career. So there's a pretty steep learning curve, even for the guys who have had seriously like storied careers. So it's coming, but there's definitely a clear learning curve with a lot of the guys. And I think midfield has been the biggest issue. You've clearly got two players who aren't great together in McTominay and Fred. And it, I think, actually looks worse in midfield under Rangnick now because of how much the pressing is important and stuff like that. So it's difficult, but you definitely see the improvement, I think.
I think you make some extremely interesting points, and in this show we're going to really be talking about a couple of players that United have certainly been sourcing and certainly been looking out at potential getting into the team and getting into the club to try and sort that midfield situation that really is coming out. And Jordan, let's kick off by looking at one of those first players right now, a guy called Dennis Zakaria. I'm being given the pronunciation by a great Aberdonian contact of mine, Derek Ray, who is the king of the Bundesliga, and very interesting player from Mönchengladbach. What have you made of him, and give us a little bit of a flavour as to his career to date so far?
So Zakaria has been in the Bundesliga for a pretty long time. I think he transferred to Gladbach around 2017 when he was like 19, 20 years old. So he's been around for a while. And he is actually one of my favorite players in the Bundesliga personally. And he has a very kind of imposing stature at 6'3", but he's much more on the skinny side. And so he's kind of this lanky midfielder who can play a variety of positions, has kind of a pretty varied skill set. And he's just generally a very interesting player to watch even today. But back in 2019-20 in that season, he was one of the best players in the Bundesliga. I think every single team would have wanted him to join them. There was Bayern Munich rumors, there was Dortmund rumors, and even kind of further up the food chain, teams were looking at him in the Premier League, and he was the player that everyone wanted to play center defensive midfield. And in March, I believe it was, he tore something in his knee while playing against Dortmund, coincidentally, and was out for just under a year, about 250 days, and missed the rest of the season, the beginning of the next season. And by the time he came back, Gladbach were in free fall because of Rose leaving. And now Gladbach has still been struggling since then, under Adi Hütter. And so he's had kind of a rocky road lately, which has probably led to the kind of lack of contract re-signing, because he's now in the last year of his deal. But I think he's really a player you got to look back at 2019 and 20 and really look at kind of what his peak can be, because when he was 23 years old, he was one of those guys that everyone was interested in.
Yeah, he's an interesting talent. You know, I know he's obviously started his situation, didn't he, in the Swiss leagues, didn't he? He was at Servette at the start of his career, wasn't he? And then he moved on to Young Boys before he moved over to the Bundesliga. The Swiss league is a very good league to get into transition, isn't it, before making the move to the Bundesliga, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a pretty wide range of players that have actually come from the Swiss league. I don't know for sure off the top of my head, but there's plenty of Swiss goalkeepers. You've got Berkey and Hitz and Sommer, who have all had pretty successful Bundesliga careers, along with a variety of midfielders who have had pretty successful Bundesliga careers. I believe Xhaka started in the Bundesliga too. My football history is not excellent, but it's one of those leagues that tends to feed into the Bundesliga, and it's pretty well known for developing really high-level players.
I mean, you mentioned earlier on there that Zakaria is a defensive midfielder. Is that his natural position, or is he more of these sort of what we call box-to-box midfielders here in the UK?
So you kind of open a can of worms with that question when it comes to Zakaria, because he's very versatile. So that's really the biggest, I think one of his easiest talking points is you've got a super versatile player. He can play an 8, he can play a 6, or he can play center back. I remember, I think it was the game that he actually tore the ligament in his knee. He was playing as a center back against Dortmund in the center of a back 3, and he was excellent and just amazing. Simultaneously, he has spent the vast majority of his career, I would say, playing as a pivot, as a defensive midfielder and a pivot. He spent a lot of time playing with Neuhaus, who is much more kind of an attacking 8. The United comparison, kind of a Fred style player. So he is, I would certainly put his dominant position as a 6. A lot of people would also disagree and say that he's closer to an 8. But you kind of get into this question just in modern football in general right now is how many of these true 6s are there left? And I think Zakaria has the skill set to be one, but he's also got the skill set to be kind of impactful higher up the pitch as well.
So in some respects, he could be a very good spine of the team player. You mentioned there he could play at central defence, and I mean we've already seen quite a lot this season Manchester United really struggling to get that balance right in that defensive area, particularly with the situation with Varane and Maguire, and obviously Lindelof's played quite a few games. Phil Jones has played the odd game as well. Could that be an interesting dynamic that United might explore?
Yeah, so it certainly opens up kind of a window of opportunity. At a bare minimum, in an injury crisis, it would be the type of thing where you've got a player who's competent playing as a center back. Zakaria is interesting because he's actually one of the fastest players in the Bundesliga. I wrote on him recently, and the Bundesliga is fun because it has all of their GPS data is very accessible, so you can see who's ran the most and who's had the highest speeds and stuff like that. And it's very accessible. And Zakaria is actually the 7th fastest player in the entire league this season, and that's post-injury. So it's pretty clear that he is still that same player, and he covers ground really well. And that was always kind of the thought process that people had when Varane was signed is okay, you've got Maguire, who's pretty slow, which is a slightly unfair criticism. He's faster than he looks, but you want someone next to him who can really eat up that ground quickly. And Zakaria would actually be an interesting pair. I don't think I would play him primarily, but yeah, it opens the window for some interesting dynamic because he can certainly play back there.
That's very interesting that you mentioned that he's very quick, because obviously an important energy component is in the midfield is where Manchester United are certainly lacking, and we all know that the Premier League is very hustle and bustle, isn't it? Do you think that environment would suit someone like Zakaria?
So one of the most fun parts about the Bundesliga for me is that it is very, very chaos driven. And the midfield in the Premier League, I think you have to be able to kind of win the ball back in that chaos, but then also slow the play down, where in the Bundesliga, the play continues to be kind of a high energy, go, 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 go. Zakaria, I would say, is pretty good at this. He's one of the more intelligent players, I would say, in midfield in the entire league. He's far from physically imposing, but he's excellent at intercepting passes, at reading the game, at reading second balls. And so in this kind of high energy environment, you've got a player who's exceptionally fast, who reads the game well, and who's very good at reading what other players around him are doing. And so I have a hard time seeing a world where he doesn't thrive in that environment in the Bundesliga, or in the Premier League, sorry.
What about at international level? Because obviously we saw Switzerland really capture the imagination at the recent European Championships, didn't they? Beating France, of course, and he was certainly picked for that. And I think he not picked for the World Cup squad as well, and maybe even the previous Euros in 2016. He certainly got international pedigree too.
Yeah, I assume because of his injury, he's kind of been a little bit on and off, and I'm not sure how much he's actually competed with the international teams. But prior to his injury in 2020, he was one of those kind of staple players that you expected to see as a part of the Swiss midfield. And yeah, like you said, that international pedigree does matter. And I also think the international game is one of those places where someone who is so physically dominant, someone who's so fast in midfield and tall and pretty strong and intelligent, like really shines. Like those international matches are some of the best matches Zakaria has probably played, because he fits the game perfectly for that situation.
The physicality aspect is something that a lot of players coming to the English Premier League sometimes struggle to get used to the adaptation of very quickly. But we mentioned earlier on, and you certainly mentioned this, that Zakaria is quite a bulky guy. That's got to be another positive attribute to his game that United fans will certainly want to have in that team.
Yeah, so Zakaria is really interesting to me because he is, while simultaneously being a pretty strong and big player, he is not very heavy. Like I would certainly put him more on the lanky side. And so you will find at times in the Bundesliga that he can get bodied off the ball. Like I think of players like Ndidi who are just strong, or Rodri too is a great one, who are just kind of strong beyond what anyone else in the league is able to even compete with. Zakaria would certainly struggle in that aspect. The difference is that he knows how to use his body really well. He can win fouls very well. One of my favorite things about Witsel is he's kind of declined with age physically, he's exceptional at winning fouls, and Zakaria is the same thing. So the physicality attribute of him, I think, is very different from people would stereotypically imagine of him. And you also have to take into account, like, there's this stereotypical belief of black players that they will be physically kind of physically imposing, which Zakaria is far from.
I mean, obviously playing a defensive midfield, he's not really renowned for a load of goals, but is he the sort of person that can maybe get into the opposition's half, maybe try and break through, try and set up kind of counterattacks or opportunities? How important is he in terms of ball control?
Yeah, so he's very impressive to me because he, while simultaneously kind of fitting this archetypal 6 where he's kind of tall and lanky and good defensively, he also is an excellent ball carrier. A lot of people won't like to hear this, but he reminds me a lot of McTominay. in a lot of ways. He's very good at dribbling, carrying the ball forward. Rice too, if you want a better comparison. He's very good at carrying the ball forwards and beginning attacks, but at times I find that he's a little bit too negative with the ball. You really kind of have to question at times. I actually wrote an article recently on Zakaria, and one of the things that I questioned was how much does manager have an impact on this? And Rose tends to have his defensive midfielders passing backwards, almost acting as a wall in buildup. And I haven't watched as much of Hooter to kind of speak on him definitively, but it's I would imagine very similar, just given the nature of the Bundesliga and Hooter's Frankfurt team. So you kind of have to consider what tactical implications are there. He seems competent at progression in a variety of methods, whether that's ball carrying or progression, but he's certainly far from like a Thiago who's just going to unleash counterattack after counterattack with every touch he gets on the ball.
I mean, we mentioned earlier on about the versatility that Zakaria really has, or the credentials that he has to if he was to join Manchester United. Where do you see his best position in terms of a midfield setup? Is he better in a flat four? Is he better in a diamond? Is he better in a three? Is he better in a five? You know, what kind of attributes best suit him, do you think?
So I have actually one of my favorite teams ever was that Rose 2019-20 Gladbach team where he played a 4-2-3-1 with Zakaria as one of the pivot members. And I personally think that this is Zakaria's best position. And it really needs to be supplemented by someone who can aid in that progression in a really big way. I believe that was Neuhaus's breakout season, but either way, Gladbach have had kind of this revolving door of experienced midfielders who are just excellent at playing balls through the lines, receiving through the lines, and this is kind of one of the spots where Zakaria does struggle. So for me, I would say that kind of a pivot is his best spot because he's certainly defensively focused. But he needs some help with the progression in midfield. And so when you kind of look at United, you've got guys like Fred, who I think really are excellent at receiving between the lines and kind of turning and playing balls. And it certainly has a positive outlook because I think the two of them would kind of complement each other's strengths really well.
Yeah, of course, Fred and McTominay have often been referred to as McFred, haven't they? So, you know, it's quite intriguing to see what Zakaria would give in that respect. Obviously, we talked about earlier on about the fact that he has had a significant injury and he is currently injured at the moment. We know that the Premier League is very intense. Do you think that might be a potential problem for him if he was to join Manchester United, do you think? Is that something that Ralph or whoever is in charge at Manchester United long-term maybe have concerns about?
Yeah, so this is really like if it isn't painfully obvious, I'm very high on Zakaria, and I think he's an excellent player, but that injury concern is there. A knee injury is one of the worst injuries that you can really sustain as a player because it never goes away. Once you have that repairing surgery, it really never is truly better. And so whether or not he is going to consistently be kind of fit it's hard to say. He's already missed, I think, 2 matches after the fact, just based on kind of knee issues, which is a very vague term, and you kind of don't know how healthy he is sometimes. He's certainly been unlucky this season too, where he's had twice that he's been quarantined because of COVID. And so it's kind of been hard for him to find a rhythm, and that certainly impacts the fitness of your knee as well. Is like, do you get the chance to go out there and play games every single week? And if the answer is no, you're going to have a hard time getting sustained fitness usually.
You mentioned earlier on that Zakaria is kind of very similar to Declan Rice at West Ham. Is that sort of the correct analogy you would use? Is he the Premier League player that's most comparable to his sort of makeup?
Yeah, I think Declan Rice is really one of the best comparisons here, but this is heavily skewed by my own personal perception of Declan Rice, and I am not the biggest Declan Rice fan. I think he does struggle progressively passing. Like, I don't think it is his strong suit in any regard. But he's certainly a very good carrier of the ball, especially through the middle of the field, which is something that overlaps between the two of them. The kind of struggle with progressive passing is something that overlaps with the two of them. And I don't think Rice is that physically imposing in any way whatsoever. He's not. I think recently he's improved a lot, but he's certainly, like, if you have a ball played into the midfield and you're trying to win a header, Rice is probably not the first guy you're looking for. And Zakaria is similar. He can be good at winning those balls in midfield, but he's not excellent at it. And he relies a little bit more on his ability to win the second balls. So I think Rice is a really good comparison. It's hard to know how his skill set would transfer to the Premier League, and that's why so many people love Rice, is because he's done it in the Premier League against some of the biggest teams. But Zakaria certainly has a very similar kind of, I would say, resume of skills, so to say.
That's very interesting to see that, and obviously glad to hear your views on that. So we have Zakaria on one side of this kind of discussion. The other side of the discussion is Amadou Haidara from Leipzig. He's 23 years of age. Give us a little bit of a flavour on his own journey so far, because he's been part of that Red Bull Academy, hasn't he?
So this is a player who's a lot of fun because he is, like, you've got the Rangnick connection, which is quite obviously why we've been linked to him. And he came up through Liefering and transferred to Leipzig. And so you've got Salzburg and Liefering and Leipzig, and you kind of got a big overlap between the systems. And so Haidara is a guy who really kind of gets what Rangnick is going for. That kind of entire club ethos was really built by Rangnick. For the people who don't know, I'm sure they do at this point. And Haidara is one of the players that Rangnick seems to have had an affinity for since he was managing Leipzig, and the work that he did with Salzburg as well. So he is certainly someone that Rangnick is familiar with. His upbringing is very familiar to Rangnick. He seems to have a lot of confidence in kind of the way that he's been coached and brought up through the academy systems. And it also helps that he's only 23, so he's still a very malleable player.
I mean, in comparison to Zakaria, who we just talked about, Haidara has got experience of playing in the Champions League and the Europa League, and he's also, I think, currently playing in the Africa Cup of Nations, isn't he? For Mali, he's a very interesting player. What similar kind of credentials do him and Zakaria have? Is he like him, a defensive midfield player, or is he kind of a bit more of that box-to-box player that I talked about earlier on?
So in terms of kind of competition credentials, they certainly overlap a lot, because Gladbach has kind of been a perennial European team in terms of the Bundesliga, especially in the past 3 or 4 years. And you're both looking at players who are internationals for their international teams and have gotten pretty consistent game time there. But in terms of positions, I would personally argue that they are very different. I think Haidara is a guy that you would certainly want playing much more as a box-to-box, but he fits this bill of kind of Leipzig midfielders who don't quite have a strict position and who have a very, very wide skill set of the kind of jack of all trades but master of none. And so he's pretty good defensively, and he's pretty good dribbling wise, and he's pretty good passing, and he kind of checks all the boxes, but he doesn't really like wow you with any of the boxes the way that, say, Zakaria does with his physical attributes per se.
Is he more of a physical player in comparison to Zakaria, or is he, much more sort of controlled on the ball, can pass it about, etc.? Give us a little bit of a flavor on that.
So here's the interesting comparison between the two. I think Zakaria is very controlled, very intelligent, as I mentioned, with the way that he uses his body. Conversely, Haidara is probably similar in terms of physique. I would put them at kind of similar strength levels. But Haidara is insane. Like, he will launch his body at any tackle he feels like. He kind of, no restraints, just balls to the wall, pressing all the time. constantly throwing his body at slide tackles or wrapping his body around players to try to win the ball. He's very intense. And it, like I said, I think it really fits kind of that Red Bull model of the really high intensity pressing.
Would it be fair to say that as things stand at the moment, that Zakaria is much more of the inverted commas finished article, if you like, than Haidara? Because, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, Haidara's 23, Zakaria's kind of heading towards the peak of his career at 25. What's your opinion on that?
So I would certainly say that Haidara versus Zakaria is certainly the more finished product, as you mentioned. He's had a couple of seasons of like truly sustained success where people were looking at him as one of the better midfielders in the entire league. Haidara is really yet to have a breakout season. He transferred to Leipzig for around £20 million and just hasn't, I wouldn't say lived up to it. He just hasn't been very good. He hasn't gotten sustained game time. He's just kind of bounced around the team, hasn't locked down a starting spot at any point. And I think he's probably got more upside to him, but it's really difficult to know whether or not Haidara is ever going to become the Haidara that you would have thought he was 3 years ago when he was playing for Salzburg in Austria.
I mean, the person that I was sort of trying to compare Haidara when I was watching some clips earlier in the last couple of days was Basuma at Brighton. He certainly had that sort of sitting in front of the defense in some ways, but he was just a destructor. Whereas, as we mentioned with Zakaria, he kind of reminded me a little bit like kind of Fernandinho at Manchester City, sort of somebody who was sort of the kind of go-between between the defense and the midfield up to the attackers. He was sort of a kind of all over the shop, sort of like a little bit like Rice at West Ham, as we mentioned earlier. Would that be a fair analysis from my side?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good comparison, Basuma particularly. The difficulty when you're kind of scouting players per se is really trying to take in the tactical context of what each manager is asking. And if you watch Haidara and any of his clips this season, you're watching him in a Marsh team, which is almost positionless in how much pressing they're doing. And it makes it difficult sometimes to really tell, like, okay, what position could Haidara play or what position does Haidara play? Whereas Zakaria really does kind of screen the defense a little bit more, and he's a little bit more controlled in his movements, I would say. Conversely, I think Basuma, like you said, really fits the profile well, but plays for a slightly more controlled pressing team in Brighton and has kind of done a much better job of staying deeper and really kind of screening the defense well. The difference that I would argue in that comparison is that I think Haidara is better on the ball than Basuma is. Basuma is far from bad on the ball, but Haidara can really be that pass-through player who links the midfield and the defense. And I think Zakaria struggles to do that a little bit more.
I mean, one of the major things that United fans have seen since Ranić has come in is that high-intensity gegenpress that, he's sort of offering to the team, this philosophy. Out of the two players, who would suit that style of play at Manchester United better, do you think?
So purely going off of their past experiences, there's no doubt about who the answer is. It's clearly Haidara. Haidara has played, I believe he played under Rangnick. I would need to have that confirmed, but I believe he did. He played under Nagelsmann and he played under Marsh. And like those last two are some seriously high intensity pressing teams. Particularly the Marsh side, where Haidara seemed to be one of the more consistent midfielders, and he seemed to finally be kind of finding some sustained success in a team that wasn't really finding sustained success. Whereas Zakaria has played under mostly Rose, who is a very kind of controlled chaos manager. You wouldn't believe it if you watched Dortmund, but his pressing is a very different tempo compared to that of the Leipzig teams kind of the past 3 years. That said, you kind of have to consider the physical attributes that are talked about, and there's no denying how insanely fast Zakaria is. He also has one of the better kind of engines in the league. He's consistently topping distance covered numbers, and there's no doubt in my mind that both of them would suit it kind of an equal amount. I think you're kind of looking at two players who are both perfectly suited to the modern game or this pressing game that Rangnick has.
There is a lot of Manchester United fans who are really keen to see that defensive midfield player, that sort of destructor in the team, and a lot of names have been bandied about, like Ruben Neves, Declan Rice. I mentioned Basuma earlier on. We've talked about two very interesting players there in Zakaria and Haidara. If you were Manchester United right now, John, who do you think United need to go out for as of, we're recording this right now, who do you think United's needs are most required for as things stand at the moment?
So for me, Zakaria is a no-brainer at this point. You're looking at a guy who's got 6 months left on his deal. You can sign him for less than £10 million, and he can play 3 positions. If he is absolutely garbage, he still adds another body to the midfield, so we stop seeing Van de Beek playing a pivot. That's at the barest minimum. You also kind of don't have expectations for this season. You sacked a manager midway through. So the success levels of Zakaria this season, if he is signed in January, is minimal. It doesn't matter how well he does or if he's really successful, because then you can tackle the problem again in January and you really spent a very little amount of money, no harm, no foul. Haidara, I feel like you're taking a much bigger risk on. He might be more accessible because I'm sure Leipzig can replace him quite easily, whereas Gladbach, I don't think would want to lose Zakaria. You've kind of got that push and pull where it's like, we really need him to really survive this season where we're struggling, but also if we don't sell him now, we get nothing for him. So it kind of got that difficult dichotomy going on at Gladbach, whereas with Leipzig, like, I think Haidara is someone that you could buy with kind of minimal negotiating stress. But yeah, Zakaria for me is just one where it's like, get the pen to the paper and just get it done, because he adds something to the team for minimal value. You've got plenty of money. You're Manchester United. Just do it. And if he's the solution, then he's the solution, you know?
I mean, the reason I asked that question is, do you think getting either of these players is attainable now? Because obviously United are still very much in the Champions League. I'm not sure if either player, particularly Zakaria, might be cup tight. I think is he not playing in the Europa League at the moment? I wasn't too sure what was happening with that. But Haidara, obviously with Leipzig, has obviously played in Europe, so that might be a bit of a factor. But certainly long term, it seems like two very, very interesting propositions there. But do you think United can go for any of those two players as of now, or do you feel that the summer is more of a likely option?
I think Haidara is one that might be more likely towards the summer. Because like I said, I'm sure Leipzig have got the replacements for him and stuff like that. But they lost Sabitzer last year. And so you kind of lost a midfield starter and gained Tyler Adams. But that team would probably be looking thin in midfield without him. And they are still very much in multiple competitions. And now with Tedesco, they are looking to get Europe again. Gladbach, like I said, I think they really would want to get something for him at the end of his deal, which he has made it pretty clear he's not renewing. And so I think Zakaria is much more attainable. I am personally astounded by the lack of noise surrounding Zakaria. He seems like the type of player who can really add to a team right now in Europe and would cost almost nothing. And it's radio silence. And we've got 11 days left in the transfer window, 12 days left. But yeah, I think Zakaria is one who is genuinely really attainable. And if he hits those 2019-20 seasons highs where he really could, because the external context is too much to ignore. The injury, manager problems over the past couple of years, like that really has impacted his level of play. Like you could be getting a player for less than £10 million who was the best midfielder in the league in 2019. and you could get him in January, and he could completely change where you stand in the table and in the Champions League, and just kind of in general overall.
Yeah, I mean, obviously United got Bruno Fernandes, didn't they, in one of the previous January windows, and they got a bit of a bounce off that. So it'll be interesting to see what United do long term, but certainly very much so in the coming days up until the end of this January transfer window, because it's quite clear that United definitely need strengthening, particularly in that midfield pivot. Well, John, it's been great to have you on All for United to just discuss both Dennis Zakaria and Amadou Haidara. On All for United has been really, really interesting, a real education for myself to learn a little bit more about those players from yourself. Where can people find you on the socials to know a little bit more about you and also some of the work that you do?
So my Twitter is JWZ Football, and I post. This year I've been trying to post weekly articles on a variety of things. Pretty soon this week, I'm actually posting an article very related to this topic, related to midfielders and kind of envisioning what the next step looks like for midfielders in kind of tactical evolution. I wrote a really big article recently on kind of analyzing Dortmund and their entire style of play and their tactics. So all that can really be found on my Twitter pretty easily.
Excellent stuff. So if anybody is tuning into this and wanting to know more about John's work, please go and check out his Twitter. I'll say that again. It's at JWZ Football on Twitter. Please remember to like and subscribe All for United and follow us on Twitter as well at All for United. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and other social media platforms. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. I hope you've had some thoughts on either player in the YouTube comments and other social media platforms. And thanks to John again for his time on the show.
Thanks for having me here.
No, it's no worries at all. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. But we're out of time. Thanks very much. Take care. Stay safe. And glory, Man United. All the best. Take care.